Hello and welcome to the Clockwerk Assembly video. I'm going to run you through all of the steps in assembling the 3-axis tourbillon, and hopefully you'll be able to follow right along. Most likely you might run into some tolerance issues and need to reprint some parts, but hopefully you can reprint smaller parts and not have to reprint too many of the big things. Make sure to run through this video and try to print parts in stages so that you know how your printer tolerances are working out and what you need to adjust before you get to the bigger parts later on. Everything you see before you is everything we're going to need to assemble it. So you have all the printed parts, the screws, the bearings, the metal shafts, you have a hammer, your screwdriver, a little file. This is Bondic, it's a type of fast-acting glue, a scissor, the string, and the weights. So let's go through quickly first the printed parts. That's what you have to get done first. And the orientation of most of these parts is pretty straightforward, but a few of them are a little tricky, so I want to point out what you could easily miss. As they're all sitting here, this is the orientation they should be printed in. Of course, they can rotate anyway in the Z, but this is the orientation they should be built up from the platform. So the first thing that's a little tricky, this guy, it's got a little nub on it. Make sure the nub prints upward. This circle one is very similar. One of these bosses protrudes, so make sure that that boss is on the top side. This fork piece is very tricky. I often mess this up when I'm printing. But there is a small tooth right here. You can see that. That has to print down. So make sure the tooth is on the bed when you hit print. These larger white parts, when you get to them, make sure the keyhole prints downward. Of course, they don't need to be white when you print it, but they currently are. This U component, there's this shape here. Make sure that shape prints with the wide part down. These ratchet teeth have to print down. And other than that, it should be pretty straightforward which direction things print in. Flat sides down, and that's pretty much it. So the first thing we're going to go through assembling here is the inner tourbillon cage, the main piece that regulates the rest of it. When we're done, this will be able to be ticked just by moving this wheel very lightly. Now, all the parts in here that aren't metal screws and bearings are printed in PLA, material called Polymax, and I put the links in the Thingiverse page. And I recommend this material. I don't know how this will work if you print in a regular PLA or if you print in ABS. I recommend the Polymax because I get great results out of it. All the parts end up flat, and it works without any sort of watch oil or anything in here to keep it moving. So this is what we're going to work on first. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all these larger components so we have enough room on the table to start assembling things. So the first thing you need to make to get to assembling this are the metal rods. There are only 3. Tried to get down to as few as possible. There are 2 different diameters. So there are 2 4mm rods and there's 1 2mm rod. If you look in this little jig that gets printed out, you'll see 3 slots. If you just make sure to cut the shafts to fit in the slot, they'll be the right length. So do that. First, I just cut these with a little hand saw and then ground the edge until there was no burrs. You don't want any sharp burrs on either edge. It doesn't matter if this is super flat or not, but yeah. So, the first thing we're going to assemble, the O, the wheel, the fork. So we need 2 larger bearings, 1 smaller bearing, and 2 short shafts, and the hammer. I know this looks like a very precise clock, but there's actually a decent amount of hammering in it. Sorry about the video cut there. I realized that the camera was out of focus. So we have our O, and we need to first put the small bearing inside of this hole. Next thing we're going to do is put the smallest shaft into that bearing. It's a little bit hard to hold, so you might want to grab a pair of needle nose pliers to hold it. Not totally necessary if you have very dexterous fingers, but don't slam your fingers. And hammer that in until it's flush. You can use the back of this jig so you don't damage whatever surface you're on. Now, this fork is the most annoying piece in the entire assembly. So there are faces on here, right here and right here, and those we're going to need to sand a little bit. So right before we even start, we're going to want to sand those down. If you look really closely, you're going to see there's like a little bit of a radii on both of these edges opposite of that face, because the printer has a 0.4 millimeter diameter nozzle, so there's a 0.4 millimeter diameter fillet on those edges. So just sand it down until you don't really see a fillet there anymore, and there's some nice sharp edges on either side of the face. That shouldn't take too long. Once you've done that, you're going to press this piece on. You should try to do this as much by hand as you can. You might need to tap it a little bit with the hammer. And keep trying to press it down and it pop through. And you want to be careful with this because you don't want this to get too loose. Now at this point, we're going to go back to the wheel. We have to put the bearings in the wheel. So put the bearing in, just hammer them flush. Second one. And then put the shaft in. The shaft should go all the way into this. So it's flush with the back here. Then you're going to hammer it into the hole next to where we put this wheel. Make sure not to mess up the fork and crushing with the wheel. And then that, you're going to get this wheel as close to that surface as possible. And if everything's the right length, that shaft will come out and be flush, but it's possible that you wouldn't want to go that far. Like if I were to go that far, then I would put it in too much. So just hammer it until it's very, very close, but it's still free spinning. Now at this point, this is where the annoying bits of these come in. So if you sanded those down nicely, and this is looking nice now, you can see how it pops between these two positions, right? And that's how you want it to work. Pop, 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 pop. Now, the problem is, let's put this back on here. This back has these two posts that it runs into. I'm going to screw this in, and most likely what's going to happen is this piece is going to prevent it from popping in those two positions properly. And if that's the case, those two faces that we just sanded down, we just have to sand them down potentially a little bit more. Because what happens is, in this position, you can get some binding in between those two positions that we just showed. So if you remember before, it's popping very freely back and forth. Well, now we have this assembled. Let's see if we can get it to pop freely between those two positions. Now see what happened here? This tooth and that tooth are colliding. So it has that second. So that was fine, but this one is getting stuck. I had to push it a little bit. That's going to cause too much friction. And so what you're going to do is you're going to disassemble this and reassemble it over and over again. And just keep sanding that tooth down a little bit. Again, this is the tooth on the fork side. So this tooth, this face of this tooth, you're going to sand down just until this doesn't catch on it anymore. Just a tiny little bit. Don't go any further than that. If you go too far, it causes other issues. I'm just going to sand this down a tiny bit. That's it. Once you get that assembled, you'll get this rocking back and forth, but I don't want to be spending 20 minutes getting that in, so I'm going to show you how to assemble the rest of this. Now, the first thing is you need to put bearings into this wheel, balance wheel. Again, the same thing, hammer and flush. We're going to put spring on. So with this side with the flat arm down, that's how we put the spring on. You'll see there are two sets of holes here. There are narrow holes and there are wide holes. The spring screws into the narrow holes. When you line them up with those narrow holes, this can go two directions. So the end of the spring is over here in this empty area instead of being where this bar is. That's correct. If this part of the spring is behind the bar, you've done it wrong. Grab a couple screws. When you get to these parts that have two screws, always screw one in until it bites. Don't go all the way, and then screw the second one in. Otherwise, the second one might not be lined up. Once you know it's lined up, you can screw the second screw in all the way, and then go back and tighten down the first screw. Now we're going to flip this over. See, I still have the end of the spring over here and the beam here. Look at the completed one. You have the end of the spring down here. The beam is down there. And this is where the fork is. Now we're going to screw in this impulse pin into the remaining two holes. And it faces this direction. So it will interface with the fork. And screw this in, again, one at a time. So you can still move it to line up with the second hole. Screw it in. Tighten down the other one. That's good. Now we're going to throw this shaft in here. We're going to go in from the side with the impulse pin, down and out. And these two holes are labeled. We're going to go into hole number 1. Now first, you're just going to hammer it until it starts coming out the back side here. And once it's coming out there, you can probably start to feel it into that number 1 hole. Once you get it in the hole, just hammer it until you're at the bottom of the hole. This should spin pretty freely. And that's good. That's what you want. At this point, we need to assemble this larger gear onto this side of this cage. 2 more screws. Screw this in until it protrudes a little bit. Try and line it up with the hole. Screw it in. Oop. Once it starts to bite, get your second screw. Put that one in. So it lines up. That starts to bite. Get that one nice and tight. And the first one nice and tight. Don't go too tight with these. Just only fingertip tight. Now we're going to come in. This is important. This impulse pin should be facing opposite of the fork so that we don't crush the fork with the impulse pin when we hammer it in. So we'll start hammering this in. And you can use the back side of this. When we get to the end, we're going to line this up with hole number 2. Now, the thing is, it doesn't always work out exactly to the depth of hole number 2. So when you're hammering this, you're going to have to keep double checking. Don't go too far. And you want to get this as close as you can before things start interfering. keep double checking, keep lining it up. Probably don't want to go all the way to the bottom of the 2, but if you do hit all the way to the bottom of the 2, then you're good. Cool. At this point, I'm going to make sure this is interfacing with the fork. So that way, you can see this part of the spring is facing away from the fork. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm in the side of the fork and going back and forth. If you're not, what you're going to do is spin all the way around until it hits and gets stuck against the fork. When it gets stuck, there we go. That just means go back almost a full turn, and you'll be in the right spot. You'll see it ticking back and forth on the fork. So once you're in the right spot, you have to put this sort of A-shaped piece in. You start pressing this on, and you might be able to just press it on with your fingers, or you might need to go back into the 2 hole and do a light couple taps with the hammer. Again, you might not be able to go all the way down into the 2. Make sure none of this is hitting it. And at this point, double check you're still in the right spot in the fork. And then you're going to put the spring in. Now the end of the spring that I keep referencing should now be lined up with those little grips on this A-shaped piece. So what you're going to do from this angle, it's kind of precise. You can use your screwdriver, you can use something else that's small. You're just going to poke the end of the spring into those little grips. Now, sometimes these print out, they're tight enough. Sometimes they print out, they're not tight enough to grab it. If they're not tight enough to grab it, you're going to use this glue, this Bondic. And you're just going to put a couple drops. Be very careful. When you place this, only place it right where that spring is interfacing. You don't need much, just a couple drops. The great thing about this is that it doesn't cure until you shoot this light at it. About 5 to 10 seconds. Give that a little bit. Now we got a spring. Now, like I said before, this hasn't been adjusted quite properly, so it's not going to tick both directions. But if everything was toleranced correctly and you did spend the time to knock down that tooth, then you would have it ticking like this. Now the last couple steps here, you're going to put these posts in. Again, just more screws. You want to make sure that a step ago when you put this A on, that you have these chamfers properly for these screws to go in. The screws should sit completely flush once you screw them in, so they're not protruding. Now you're going to go through, you're going to put both these posts on both sides, right? These are counterweights. They help balance out the entire assembly around this axis, so it's not weighted improperly one way or the other. Once you get these 2 posts in, the next and final step on this cage is to hammer on the 2 outer bearings. So again, you can use the back side of this jig, hammer bearing on, take the other bearing, hammer it on. It should be flush with the ends of the shafts if you've hammered it on correctly. And at that point, when you get both of these on, you have the main cage. Again, this one's not working. You would need to tweak that tooth. But once you get it working, you'll have it ready to be mounted along this axis. Again, you would put the second one in here, just like it attaches the first, and you'll end up with this. So we'll put this aside for now. If anyone has any questions on how to get that ticking, let me know, and I'll try to answer them on the Thingiverse page. But just about adjusting the fork tips. After this, it's pretty smooth sailing. So, you have your ticking cage for your first axis of the tourbillon. And now we're going to build the second cage around it. So we take these first few gears and this first bridge. You take the post pointing up and you put this gear in from the top. Flip it upside down. Again, make sure that the screw holes are such that the screw is flush. You're going to screw these into the bottom of the post. Second screw. Now we're going to put this large hollow gear on. At this point, we're going to use these structures at the end. This piece with the shorter post is asymmetric. One side will fit around here, the other side does not fully fit. So take the side that fits, put a screw in. Take this hollow gear, put it around. Take this cap and put it on top. Put this piece on the other end and make sure that the post is pointing outward. The tourbillon cage with the gears up, and you're going to mesh these gears in with the gears that are here. The bearing is going to fit inside of a recess at the top, and then the gear on the wheel and the gear at the center will mesh with the two gears on this assembly. On the opposite side, we have to put the second bridge, and again, this isn't just big to show off my name. This is big because it is counterweight to make sure we're balanced in this direction. The same way the posts keep it balanced in that direction, this larger beam keeps it balanced in this axis. Once we get these two screws in here, we're going to have the full first axis of the tourbillon working. We can move on to axis number 2. And at this point, you can get this to start ticking by pulling down on this part of the frame. And that's one axis of the tourbillon. The second axis, the first thing we're going to do, we take this U, this is the post that connects to it, and this is the bearing. So we have to assemble the bearing and the post first. These are very tight together. It's like that on purpose. And if you look closely, you can see there's a wedge here. What we're going to do is assemble this into the larger outer part. So once you get these in together, you look at that wedge, you match it up with these. It only fits one way. Match it up, flip it over, and take these. Now these screw on with the keyholes facing up, and you split the seam. Don't screw it like this, or it's just going to fall apart. Split the seam with these. These are what hold it together. 4 screws each. Go around the perimeter and screw these in. Again, don't go too tight with these. Only go about fingertip tight. Otherwise, you'll strip out all the plastic. If you have to take it apart, reassemble it, you want to be very careful that you don't strip everything. So go around, put in the 8 screws. The next thing we're going to do after this is assemble the clutch and pulley mechanism. Which allows you to easily wind up the counterweight to power the device. That all sits within this recess. So you take the small clutch wheel and the larger pulley wheel, you insert them together until they fit. Now they're like flush like this. You're going to take some of your fishing line or whatever string you're using. However high you think this is going to be hanging on your wall, cut roughly that amount. Loop it through these holes and give it a little knot. A square knot works, but you can use whatever knot you like to use. It's not super important to use any particular type of knot. String it through the hole down below. Now you're going to screw this into the post. It can be a little tricky to line these up. It's designed so you can screw these in first so they're protruding, and then try to find your first hole. Once you get that in, don't tighten it all the way. Go with the second one, and go back and forth until you find the hole. Now you can screw it in all the way. The other one in all the way. Make sure you put all 4 in. And we're getting very close to getting our next axis into the system. Now the second axis, if we were to assemble this outside of the system, this would be our second axis. But the easiest way to assemble it is to first put the second axis into the third. Now take this U, and you're going to do the same thing we just did below, and screw it into this post. So wait till the screw protrudes, find one of the holes with it, and screw into it. Do the diagonal, the opposite hole, so you can find the matching hole. Okay, this goes in, tighten all the way. Make sure to tighten all 4. Again, don't tighten them too much. Just make sure that everything goes in and everything is flush. Now once you get this assembled, you might notice that the shaft spins within the bearing, or that the bearing spins within the outer bowl. It's not important what spins inside of what, as long as something spins inside of something. At this point, we can put this larger gear on the outside. It just slides on. One screw goes in the back to hold it in place. You'll notice there's a lot of assembling here, and you might think, why didn't we just print these as one part? This was to cut down on the amount of support that would be needed in the print jobs. At this point, you can snap this piece on. I really like doing that. And it's one screw in here that holds it to the U. The last part of the assembly here to get these axes in is this gear. Again, you're probably going to want to push these through a little bit so that you can line them up. So screw it in. Again, don't screw it in on the way. You have to line up the second one. Just fingertip tight. At this point, you have all three axes, and if you put your hand around the back, spin it in this direction, you can actually get it ticking. If this isn't ticking for whatever reason, you might need to adjust some tolerances. A lot of what will happen is this gear will pop, you might see some other gears pop, or there might just be way too much friction for this to work, in which case you'll have to go back to your heart of the mechanism and make sure everything is running as freely and as loose as possible. But if everything's working, you're up to the easiest step, which is just putting some weights into this little weight holder. I find that if you put the letters facing in, that's best. So just make another loop with another square knot here. You can pull this. If this knot's a little long, you can sometimes double it, or it doesn't particularly matter, but you might want to make it shorter so it fits within here. Put the second one on, and then you put this cover on. 4 screws. It's a little tricky because you're sort of blind lining these up, but you can eventually find it if you look through and line up the other 3. Don't tighten these too much. Again, you don't want to strip the plastic. But once you get them lined up, screw in, get all 4 going. Once you get all these screws in, you're done. You're ready to wind it up. So winding is pretty simple. It only winds in one direction. So sometimes this will happen. Just come around again, pull this tight, and make sure that as you're winding, you might need to push that knot inside, and then you're good. And that's how you wind it up. And I'll go ticking. If you want to store it, it sits nicely on top of the weight. If you want to hang it on the wall, there are 2 holes mounted at 160 millimeters apart. And you're done. You're done. Congrats. Enjoy it. Let me know if you make one. Cool. Have a good day.